Right. Well, let's see. Last week was a fairly hectic run through evolutionary theory, a bit of evolutionary economics and economic dynamics. This is not going to be much slower. So I want to go through monetary macroeconomics, and all of you have done behavioural finance if you haven't just so far, so you've got some familiarity with the area. I'll be doing a bit of a repeat of some of the material covered there, but in slightly more detail. But what I want to actually start with, something I was going to do anyway, but Mark's presentation last week gave me an extra reason to do it. And that's that he referred to one of the justifications that neoclassicals gave for going to DSGE modelling was the argument that there'd been a failure of deterministic trade cycle models. So I asked Mark to send a paper reference to me, and that's a bit of an extract of it there. It's rather hard to read on the screen. This is a, what's his name again? This is a recent textbook, 2009, on, what's it actually? Business Cycle, Evidence Theory and Policy, a particular chapter. The whole thing is about this guy's on the mathematical methods for economists and so on. And he argues here that Keynesian models of business cycles are at best ad hoc. I think you could actually call it neoclassical model ad hoc. So the idea is if you want to have a model of business cycle behavior, you need to have a second order difference equation with complex roots. I'll talk a bit about that later. The easiest way is to introduce lag into the behavioural equation model, which is samples and make it consumption dependent on lag level of income, and investment dependent on lag consumption, same advice as employed by Hicks. Now, all that's correct about what they did to get the models, but the rest of this is crap. Provably crap. And he says, so what you get out of this is you get the possibility of cycles, but it's difficult to reconcile the characterization of empirical facts because the evidence shows that cycles are anything but regular, yet similar to the model produces cycle of the same duration, implies perfectly predictable, blah, blah, blah. Given all this, you can get cycles by imposing, you can get variable cycles by imposing one cycle on another, but the pattern is still predictable, and then you find this punchline. And see the ordinary model that's a cycle correspond to empirical evidence. We have no choice but to introduce random shocks to the system. And this is why Peter and Prescott did in the real business cycle model, so it all had to happen because, that's the only way. Well, that's total bullshit. Ignorant bloody dribble. Sort of stuff that neoclassics have been getting away with for the last 40 years. It's garbage, and I want to go through and show why. So, as usual, we have an equilibrium fixation. The idea they have is to say the only way you can explain the cycle is by having an equilibrium mechanism subject to exogenous shocks. Now, if you go back to the 1930s and 1960s, there was a brief flowering of dynamics back then. And as this guy was talking about, it was all about what they call multiplier accelerator models of the trade cycle. I'll go away. Let's Okay. Now, it began with Harrod. He had essentially a non-equilibrium argument in what he called essays in dynamic theory. This and a few other papers by Harrod over the next 30 years began with a non-equilibrium argument. But of course, can't have non-equilibrium, so guess who crashed on it again? Dear old John Hicks. Just like he destroyed Keynes, he ended up destroying Harrod as well, and gave us these multiplier accelerator models of the trade cycle, which went nowhere, as the neoclassical guy I quoted to begin with argued, and for good reason, but nothing like the reason that neoclassicals themselves gave. So I want to go through and show why it fell over. So you start with Harrod trying to make Keynes' general theory dynamic, and in a formal sense, Keynes' model was not dynamic. You certainly had chapter 12, chapter 17, the final chapter of the book, talking about disequilibrium and so on. But in terms of the technical, any technical component to Keynes, you could argue that it was static. And Harrod began by saying, well, attempts to do dynamics, looking at the work of Ragnar Frisch, who's the guy who originated econometrics, actually founded the Journal of Econometrica back in, I think, 1932-33. The way that Frisch generated a model of the trade cycle was to have a stable mechanism subject to exogenous shocks. And that's what Harrod began by criticising. And what he said here is the majority, this is Frisch now, the Frisch saying, what do we actually see in the world? Well, we see oscillations in the economy. They are probably free oscillations, meaning you have a stable mechanism subject to exogenous shocks. Okay? That's the framework that Frisch began with. And The idea was you have a series of erratic shocks hitting a stable system, and the erratic shocks hitting a stable system give you cyclical behaviour at varying period, which is exactly where we've got to with the DSG model some 80 years later. Now, that idea of the model being stable and tending towards equilibrium but subject to shocks from the outside is something Harrod actually rejected. His argument was quite sensible. He said you can generate cycles by adding lags to a stable system. Again, we come back to this idea that the neoclassical guy mentioned. But he says there's some doubt as to the trend. Okay, you're imposing a trend on top of this. How do you explain the trend? And he made the very sensible argument that it's possible the trend itself may be generating the forces that give you oscillation. So there's a way in which the trend and the cycle are embedded in each other in Harrod's vision. And he said, therefore, okay, lags matter, but let's actually look at the process of endogenous instability in the system as well, fundamentally. That's what Harrod was arguing for. And he said, let's forget about the assumption of equilibrium. This is the expert on Harrod, a guy called Daniel Bassani. If you want to really understand Harrod's theory, then you have to look at Bassani's work. Totally comprehensive coverage of everything Harrod's ever done, not just on the area of the trade cycle here, but also his role in developing the idea of marginal revenue. So Harrod's played some important roles in economics, and Daniel definitely knows him better than anybody else who's ever lived. So he said what Harrod was saying, let's abandon the assumption of stability and bring in something which actually is destabilising in the system endogenously. So the way that Harrod went about it was to say, well, let's put together three propositions. The first, that the level of income determines savings. That the rate of increase of income is actually, I think it's got a term being confusing here. The rate of increase of income is what generates investment. The way he puts that is actually rather confusing. I'll put an equation that makes more sense to it in a moment. And the demand equals supply. So unfortunately, not quite the argument I'd like to see, but still. So he said this is a combination of the accelerator and multiplier. The multiplier accelerator concept is part of Harrod's thinking here. But what he argued was savings is a function of income. Investment depends upon the rate of change of income. That's what he's really saying by the second statement there. And you equate the two. Okay? Those are his three equations to try to get some sort of dynamics together. He didn't quite derive it this way, but this is one way of going about his logic. So he starts with saying, let's say investment equals savings. Again, using the assumption that Keynes used as an organizing concept in the general theory. And now let's divide it by income. So saying investment ratio equals the savings ratio. And bring in change of income over change of income. Okay? Rearrange the terms. And what you've now got is Harrod's fundamental equation. It doesn't take long to get there, it's pretty simple. We call that the incremental capital to output ratio, the ratio of investment to change in output. That's the growth rate, change in income divided by income itself, and that's the savings ratio. So with those three, you had this sort of relationship which you used in several different guises. So C stands for this incremental capital to output ratio, G is the growth rate, and S is the savings ratio. And he then played around with it and says there's actually three types of growth. There's what actual growth, which would reflect actual change in capital divided by output and the actual savings ratio. Then what he called the natural rate of growth. And like a typical economist, he presumes the natural is the maximum possible. It's like if somebody asks you how does your car travel? Let's say 200 kilometres an hour. It's just natural speed, flat out. Nonetheless, maximum rate of growth is what he called natural. And the third he called warranted, and that's the level of growth that fulfills capitalist expectations. And that's where he did most of his interesting arguments about why the system is inherently unstable. And he had what he called the instability principle. And that was that if you define the warranted growth rate as the ratio of S to C, and the actual growth rate is S to CR, well, that's recorded capital ratio, then if G is greater than GW, then this, which is the amount that actually increases CR, is going to be greater than what capitalists are happy with. This one is like a behavioural variable for the warranted rate of growth. If you have the rate of growth being such that this ratio is maintained, then capital's expectations are fulfilled, and therefore they're going to continue doing the same thing in the next time period. But if, in fact, if actual growth is greater than the warranted rate of growth, then the amount that's actually accumulated is going to be less than desired by the capitalists, and therefore they're going to want to accumulate more. Okay, so you have if G is greater than GW, then the actual increase in capital is less than the desired increase in capital for that change in output. So growth will accelerate, and he didn't call it the knife edge himself, but that's the best way to describe the overall expression. And Harrod actually protested that was an inaccurate description of his theory. It wasn't. It's quite an accurate description. So he said if the actual rate exceeds the warranted rate of growth, then producers will not feel they've produced or ordered too much. On the other hand, they'll be running short of stocks. And the basic way to think about this is imagine you've got some sort of ratio. Say you're selling a corner shop, you're selling Coke. Okay? And you want to have a certain ratio of stock of Coke, the Coca-Cola bottles in the fridge versus your actual sales. So you order a certain level of sales, you order the stock to suit that level of sales. Then you sell more than you expect, your fridge is going to run down. So your response is to go out and order yet more Coca-Cola. So you actually amplify the tendency. That's the sort of dynamic he's talking about. So that gives him a knife edge instability. If you grow slightly faster than the warranted growth rate, you'll therefore invest more and accelerate even further away. If you're growing more slowly, you'll invest less and slow down. Now, the model itself is unimportant. It didn't go anywhere. And Harrod spent 30 or 40 years waffling around with much the same terms without ever particularly progressing it. He wasn't technically particularly skilled. You see far better work done by Richard Goodwin, who actually argued to me in a letter once that Harrod stole this idea from him. Long story. Anyway, what actually mattered in the model is not what Harrod tried to do, we didn't get particularly far. What neoclassicals did, and as usual, along comes John Hicks with what he calls a review, in which he develops a model that stuffs up what he's supposed to be reviewing. Typical John Hicks in the early days. And he actually rejected the possibility of instability, and this is where he made his error right from the very starting point by saying, well, Harrod welcomes the instability because he thinks that explains the fluctuations. Here we go, a mathematically instability does not generate fluctuation. A mathematically unstable system doesn't fluctuate, it just breaks down. Now that is true of a linear system, but it is not true of a non-linear one. So as usual, there's an extension of something which is true about a limited range of models by neoclassicals applying it to all models. So here he goes. Here's the book I'm reviewing. Guy makes a mathematical error where in fact Harrod is wrong, Hicks is wrong on Harrod. Therefore, let's make it functional. I've been tempted to go beyond the ordinary functions of a reviewer. I wonder how different economics would be if Harrod and Hicks hadn't always come to that temptation, done the same thing to the general theory and also to Harrod. So here's what he did. He started by saying, we've got to bring in frictions, and guess what? We're going to use lags. The same stuff that Harrod said he didn't think you should actually base the entire thing on lags. Hicks, now as a reviewer, brings it back in again. And I love this little slap in the face to Harrod. This isn't a review. Imagine Harrod's reaction when he read this. It is not generally realised, brackets, Mr. Harrod has certainly failed to realise it. Okay? Quite insulting in a published review. I mean, the sort of thing I might get away with anyway. But in this case, what he does is quite wrong. He says, let's bring in lags. And what he does, he converts the relationship first to a discrete form. Starting from that particular relationship, he says, well, let's now put growth in discrete forms. Okay, yn minus 1 over yn for n being a particular year. And then, well, the C part, now it's decidedly queer, as he put it, literally, I've got the inverted commas there. Here we go. It's not reasonable to think that current investment depends upon output in the same period, which is fair enough. What he says is, let's actually say investment, which is the C component of this model, depends upon change in income over the previous periods. Now he also slips in a quickie here. He bases consumption upon income in the previous period. Now there's no valid reason to say consumption now depends upon income last year. Okay? He's only doing it because if he doesn't do it, he doesn't get a cyclical model, which he doesn't actually justify at this point. But that's what he's doing here. So he makes investment depend on a lagged change in output, which is fair enough. But he then says consumption depends upon last year's income, which is nonsense. Okay? Anyway, that's only the start of it. So he said there's investment as some constant, C now, multiplied by the change in income of the previous two time periods, which I'm not going to object to all that much. But this one, where it says consumption is the 1 minus savings rate times income in the previous year, which is, again, one of the great reasons I don't like difference equations in economics is that virtually every time this is done, economists don't use the right time period to lag it. I'd be quite okay about saying that this consumption this week, this fortnight, is based on income in the previous fortnight. That's quite valid. So therefore, if I was working in weeks, I would be saying consumption now is a function of income y t minus 2, where t is measured in weeks. But if that was the case, and I'm then taking a look at investment, then I'd be saying investment this week is based on the change in income 52 weeks before and 104 weeks before. Okay? Now you look at even the model that Wynne-Gogley did. He never actually did that. And he also introduced these artificial lags equations to stop things being algebraic loops rather than closed forms. So I'm no great fan of difference equations in economics. And this is one of the many instances as to why. So what he then says, okay, savings now is going to be income now minus consumption now. Then you get this expression for savings, we're going to put those lags. And then he equates savings now to investment now. Anybody spot any problems with this so far? There is. I'll show you shortly. So having got, there's your error expression. And he then rearranges things to say income now is going to be 1 minus S plus C times income the previous year, minus C times income the year before that. And that was the basis for the multiplier accelerator models that dominated the attempt at dynamics back in the 40s to 50s and 60s. Now, what it generates is cycles, but no growth, whereas Harrod's relationship is a growth relationship. And the equilibrium of the system is 0. So to actually make growth happen, he then imposed a growth trend, independent of the actual dynamics. All the stuff that Harrod said you shouldn't do. Okay, so he basically emasculated what Harrod was trying to do, and that became the neo-Pascal model, or the preferred model of the trade cycle. Back when I was a school student doing economics, we actually got given Hicks's trade cycle book as one of our textbooks, which shows how much more difficult economics was still back in when I went through than you guys are doing these days. But anyway, I confronted the stuff back when I was about 16. Now, the way that economists analysed it is one of the many stuff-ups that economists have done, because they said, let's look at the dynamics of this, let's analyse this behaviour using what's called the characteristic equation approach to analysing a difference equation, or a ODE. And I'm going to point out there's an error by doing what mathematicians sort of do, which is what I did when I was doing my master's degree, and when I realised there's a problem with this particular model, that 30 or 40 years, well, at the time I did my master's, 50 years of economists hadn't actually realised. So here's 3 sample outputs from the model. They've got a value of saving rate of 30% and a C of 0.9. Now C is supposed to be something like the accelerator. And the accelerator relationship between capital stock and output is supposed to be something at a level of 3. So you need 3 times as much capital to produce a certain amount of output. Here we've got it being less than 1, which itself is pretty crazy. There's plenty of signs that there's something seriously wrong with this model that economists have missed. But anyway, there you get cycle convergence to an equilibrium output of 0. Here's another one where I've got S greater than 1, and notice what you get, increasing cycles. Okay. Now, you cannot fit that to a growth trend. If you fit it to a growth trend, you're going to get the cycles ultimately being far larger than the rate of growth, so it becomes highly unstable. So economists stuck with this one to try to model it. If they made C anything like the actual value that it takes in the economy, that's what happened. Massively negative output predicted for the future. And there's textbooks devoted to this stuff. You know, if you're actually doing a standard course in dynamics, I imagine you'd find yourself being taught this model to begin with in some detail, although again I got back on master's degree. Now lots and lots of waffle about it, but it all died out because, and people thought, well, dynamics doesn't matter, let's get back to doing, what we know we should be doing, equilibrium analysis and so on, that actually helped kill what could have been dynamic economics. And it's easy to find an obvious mistake in it, but I'll take you through the way that economists analysed it, and that's what they call the characteristic equation approach, which is an old-fashioned technique that mathematicians used to use, but now they pretty much don't bother with it. Did you learn that at all in dynamics? Yeah. Had to do a bit of it, but you mainly did what matrix conversions, I imagine. That's what I found before. I'm going to show you now. Okay, what you do, you have an equation like this, which is second-order linear homogeneous differential equation. Homogeneous because the term on the other side is zero. Then it's a function or a constant. It's an inhomogeneous and slightly more complicated to solve. But there's your equation. You want to find a value for y, a function that solves that equation. The way that mathematicians proceed is say, well, let's take a guess. Okay? And the guess they say, let's guess that y is e raised to the power of r times t. Okay? Because one of the things about the exponential function, differential involves its own value. Let's feed it in there and see what we get. For r is an unknown constant, you're trying to solve and work out, well, you're trying to solve the equation, and that's your guess to begin with. Make a substitution, and you get a times the second differential of e to the rt, plus b times the first differential of b to the rt, plus c multiplied by e to the rt is all equal to 0. Okay? Now then you do your differentiation, and out of the first one, you're going to get a times r squared. Okay? Differential of e to the rt is r times e to the rt, do it twice, you get r squared. Second is b times r to the e times rt, and finally you're still left with the original term in c. You then collect your terms, and you've now got a polynomial multiplied by e to the rt equal to 0. Now, e to the rt is always greater than 0. The exponential is always positive. So the only way that can be true is if the roots of this equation, where the roots of this equation apply, where you get the roots of the equation, then that will give you 0, and that'll be the correct term. So you do it, and you say, well, let's find the roots of that polynomial equation. And now you've converted solving something that's really complicated, differential equation. You've converted it to just solving a polynomial. We all know how to do that, don't we? Okay, you put in the e equals, your solution is now going to be y is some linear combination. The b raised to the power of the square root, 1 value square root plus c, another constant multiplied b, and the negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac out of 2a. So you've solved the equation. That's about as far as most economists go in, of course, in differential equations. And the same thing applies with difference equations, slightly, well, that's not much more complicated. There's your expression, a multiplied by y at t plus 2, plus b of y at t plus 1, plus c of y at t equals 0. That's a simple difference equation. And you have a similar generic expression. You think that y at t is going to be equal to some constant r raised to the power of t. So you do your substitution there, and you get a to the rt plus 2, plus b times rt plus 1, plus c times rt equals 0. Collect your common terms. Again, you take r to t on the outside. Again, you've got a polynomial. Solve the polynomial. It's the root of a simple quadratic. And you've got the general solution. It's now going to be this root raised to the power of t plus the other root raised to the power of t. Simple procedure. And I've got a couple of papers I've linked there where people go through and crap on about this for quite some time. But you could have avoided the whole thing if only they'd done what mathematicians do. Because what mathematicians like to do these days is convert those higher order differential equations into systems of first order equations and solve them using what we know about linear algebra or using the properties of matrices. So I'll take you through that. Here's the differential equation. You then rearrange it. So you say what the you want to convert it to the differential of a vector is equal to some matrix multiplied by the vector. Okay, that's a vector equation way of stating exactly the same system. So you say the differential of x, where x is two x over and x1 of both functions, is going to be some constant matrix multiplied by the current value of those functions. So how do you do it? Well, you rearrange and start with the highest terms and saying the second order term d2x dt squared, dividing through by the constant, so I get that particular value. It's going to be minus d over a times dy dt minus c over a times y. It's just reorganized this equation. Then make up a couple of variables x0 and x1, where x0 is the variable y, and x1 is the first differential of x0, which is therefore going to be dy dt. And then the differential of x1 is going to be the second differential of y, which I already know, which I can now substitute here. I'm not going to force you to do this, I'm just showing you the step-by-step that's involved from a mathematician's point of view. So I can now say this expression, where x0 and x1 and two new variables taking the place of y and y dy dt, that vector differential equation is exactly the same as that system of second order equations up there. Now, why would I bother doing all this? Well, I can now use the properties of matrices to analyse the system. I now say, what's the property of this matrix? And then say, that will tell me whether the system is stable or unstable, etc., etc. But one essential thing for this to be a valid dynamic model is this matrix. You cannot invert this matrix. And I'll show you why. There's your equation. If you're going to get meaningful results out of it, in some sense, that A has to be equivalent to 0. I'll show you what I mean. Let's say that's your solution. X of t is a vector of constants multiplied by e raised to the power of r times t. You're trying to solve for r. Then that means that taking the differential of all this is going to be equal to a times x. So I'm now saying the differential of this whole expression, I should put brackets around that is going to be r times that expression, which is going to be r multiplied by the identity matrix times x, which is going to be equal to a times x, just expanding out the equation. Now, I, of course, is the identity matrix. One's on the horizontal, it's nothing. No, one's on the axis. Now you rearrange all that, and I say r times, subtract across by a minus a times x, so we've got r times I times x minus a times x. Reorganise that, so I've got to bracket out properly. R times I minus a multiplied by x is equal to 0. Now that 0, of course, is again a matrix of zeros. Now that is only going to return non-trivial values in this vector. I'm trying to find values for a vector here soon. I'm going to get non-trivial values of that vector if that Ri minus a is somehow equivalent to 0. Have you done determinants? You have? Okay, good. So the determinant of that of a has to be 0. Because when you do this, you don't want to go to invert it. Because if you can actually invert the expression, then the only solution is going to be x is equal to 0. Okay? Which you don't want, which is the trivial solution. Because a model which only has a trivial solution isn't a model at all. That's Hicks's model. It's only got the trivial solution. I'll show you what happens. There's our expression. So that's all we're working out of going across the x1 at t is y at t, x2 at t is x1 at t plus 1, which is y at t plus 1. So x2 at t plus 1 is y at t plus 2, with all the substitutions. I can finally restate that difference equation now as a vector difference equation. So x at t plus 1 and x with 2 at t plus 1 is going to be a multiplied by those values where a is this particular matrix. Now, I can invert it. That's the inverse of the matrix. So what it's telling me is the model only has a trivial solution. It's not really a model. There has to be a logical error in getting a model that looks like this. There's something logically wrong there. And that's why I said, did you notice anything wrong with it beforehand? What's actually going on? The way it was derived was by equating a lagged relation to actual savings, which is this one. Of course, it's bullshit to lag consumption, as I said beforehand, but at least that neoclassical was right about that particular point. Equating that to a quotient for desired investment, because C was supposed to be desired investment. And saying investment now will be some function I'll change in output, where C is roughly the function that says how much investment will be. Now you find me a theory of economics that says actual saving plus equal desired investment. There is none. Not Keynes, it's not neoclassical, it's no model at all. So what it's really asking The question of the model is actually saying, what level of output is compatible with actual savings equal desired investment? And the answer is zero output. It's a trivial question. So it's not actually a model at all. And so it wasn't the trade cycle models failed because the deterministic models themselves were bad. It failed because the model they used wasn't a model at all. It was nonsense. An enormous amount of economic ink has been spilled talking about something which is a non-model. Typical for economists, you know. So a bit of decent mathematical training. Hopefully somebody would have done this before I did. Unfortunately not. Now, it could have been very different because if you had a sensible approach to what Harrod was talking about and you took Hicks's argument seriously, but you could say, okay, well, let's say investment is a function of change in output. That's fair enough. So say investment will be some constant multiplied by the change in output in the previous two periods. But then say investment adds to capital stock. So the capital stock now will be capital stock in the last time period plus investment in the last time period. Of course, capital stock produces output, so you can now say output now is capital stock now divided by the accelerator relation, which is fair enough. And expand that all to saying therefore output now is 1 over v times t minus 1 plus 5t minus 1. Substitute what it at minus 1 is, and subject that k is v times y. Divide through, and you get a third order model. And that says output now will be output in the previous period plus the ratio of the desired capital to output ratio over the actual ratio multiplied by the change in output in the two time periods before that. Now, it's not worth pursuing as a model. We can do far better than that these days. But if that had been what Hicks had done, this is what we would have had. I'm putting it here also including Samuelson's argument that investment is a function not of just a change in output, but change in consumption over the previous two time periods. So I included the savings rate beside there. And that's the expression I get. And you get growth with cycles. If C is substantially greater than V, you get growth in cycle which remain in proportion to each other. If it's a lot greater, a faster rate of growth. And if S is particularly high, the growth peters out over time. So you get the paradox of fruit turning up as well in a sort of way. So we could have had a far better set of models than we got out of the neoclassicals and out of Hicks. And as usual, Hicks stuffed up where economics could have gone. So that's why, again, coming back to the neoclassicals, even today, I mean, I read that guy's, I managed to use Google Books to steal a few pages out of it. And I couldn't believe the ignorance, because you could get away with a book arguing like he argued about the deterministic cycle and so on in 1960. But 1962 or 3 was when Lorenz invented his third order nonlinear equation for fluid dynamics. We've moved enormous distance since then. So it's sheer ignorance to make the claim that that guy made in the book. And I want to illustrate that. We're talking now about Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. So again, you've all been through this with me before. If you haven't done behavioural finance, have you with me? Okay, it'll be new for you, so that's good. So I see Minsky's hypothesis. Have you ever mentioned Minsky? Good. Pardon? With Margaret, good. Okay. So you get, I see Minsky as integrating a whole range of different visions together, coming out of Marx, where you get the one that I've talked about with you before, the idea of dialectical dynamic within goods market, labour market, money market. Schumpeter, who really gave us the idea of evolutionary dynamics and was very strong on the role of credit in the capitalist economy. And Keynes with expectations under uncertainty in the role of speculation and so on. Irving Fisher talking about debt deflation. And to me, it's also an explanation of the current crisis. So his vision was inherently different to the neoclassical. That's why it's so much fun watching people like Paul Krugman try to interpret it. I mean, he's never going to get to first base, as I think he's shown rather spectacularly in the last month. Is because the conventional neoclassical vision of capitalism is that any serious depression is a man-made phenomenon. If it only had Ben Bernanke running the Federal Reserve back in 1930, there wouldn't have been a Great Depression. Doesn't quite fit with current facts, does it? You know? He says what he says, he calls it unreconstructed Keynesian. The capitalism inherently flawed, being subject to booms, crises, and depressions, and that's, he argues, essential for full-blown capitalism. He's not saying it's prices you can remove, he's saying it's essential. I think there are ways to actually minimise the volatility, but that's Minsky's overall vision. He said, therefore, the financial system will generate the signals that cause an accelerating desire to invest and then financing that investment as well. So it's an inherently cyclical, unstable vision of capitalism. Equilibrium doesn't apply. And he was trying to understand both booms and the busts. You've got to claim both periods in capitalism. And why haven't we had the Depression? The major question, we thought, his perspective writing in the 1960s and 1970s, was that the thing we have to explain is why we haven't had the Depression between 1940 and 1980. And to do that, you have to have a model that can generate depression. Fundamentally saying, if you have a model of capitalism that can't generate depressions, you haven't got a model of capitalism. You've got a model of a mythical system, not the one we actually live in. So he said, financial crises, rather than seeing as an anomaly or something caused by bad economic management, blah, 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 had to be a normal event in an unconstrained capitalist economy. And he had to explain why that hadn't happened between 1948 and 1966 when he wrote this particular passage. That the first 20 years of financial tranquility, that since 1966, there'd been financial turmoil. Now, interestingly enough, I don't think Minsky ever did this particular statistical comparison, but if you remember that graph I showed you of the Dow Jones, it peaked in 1966 when he deflated it by the CPI. And it peaked at a high level in 66, and it peaked at relative to the CPI back in 1929. So it was really a turning point, as he identified it here. He said, from this stage on, there have been more and more interventions since 66, but not yet a crisis. Now, talking about 48 to 1978, we talked about the credit crunch in 1966, when the Federal Reserve had to intervene for the very first time. And the second in 1970, commercial paper on the failure of Penn Central Railroad, and then a third in 74, 75. This one probably had the most impact on me as it happened, because that happened when I was graduating from my law degree. And what I thought was, as a student at the time, no problem getting a job. Bournemouth came along, and I was competing against really old blokes who were like 40 years old, for a job, and I was leaving my university at the age of 22. So these are the crises that Minsky saw developing from that point on. And he said, therefore we have to regard these not as accidental, but as systemic. Unless we can explain these events as a natural part of the system, again, we're not explaining capitalism itself. And we have to explain the anomaly. Why was that period from 1945 to 1965 so stable? So, if you look at the long-term data as well, one point that John Black made very well in his dynamic economic systems is if you want to have a real test case for the behaviour of the capitalist economy, where you can't blame the Federal Reserve and you can't blame government intervention, pick the 19th century. Because capitalism was well and truly in control by the state, particularly in America. And you find you have pro-cyclical prices, frequent wage falls, and financial crises every, I thought 20 years there, but it's everything from 8 to 15 years seem to be the normal cycle, particularly in England, but also America. The financial crises are regular, periodic events without any Federal Reserve to blame, also including a period where there's a private money system, the 19th century free money system applied in a lot of America. So, this is where you can't actually blame the government for causing the crises. But he then said, you've still got to look at another thing about the post-1973 period is that it's been aborted. Crises have been aborted by government intervention in some fashion or other. Either government spending has slowed down the decline, or the Federal Reserve has dived in and changed the rules and stopped organisations going back, in that case, should fail. So he's talking about the roles of an immensely larger government system. And his perspective on the government was that it actually evolved in a fairly natural. Again, seeing crisis as a normal part of capitalism, and seeing capitalism becoming a large-scale system with the government sector that was expected to do something. When the crisis of the 1930s hit, it was either the dole or starvation. So the dole, Social Security expands as a response to that crisis. And then out of that response, you got the development of a large government sector, much, much larger post-1930 than it was before 1930. He said, but he also, at one point where actually Minsky made a wrong prediction, by the way, and this is one reason I argue in favour of putting your logic into verbal, which are really verbal differential equations, putting them in actual differential equations, because one prediction he made at this stage, affected by the milieu at the time he wrote in the early 80s, was that accelerating inflation was likely to be one happening. Well, it did for a while, but then it well and truly slowed down, both with the local period, growth of China, and so on. Anyway, how do you turn this into a theory? Well, first of all, you build on your antecedents, and that's the important background of where a bit of what Paul Krugman refers to as Talmudic research is worthwhile. Minsky's careless met at the Communist Party social function. So you'd have to imagine that a few copies of Das Kapital are floating around a family living room. He then fought in the Second World War, came back to do a degree, did maths first of all, and changed over to economics. Now, there's no way he'd reveal that he'd read Marx at this period in America's history. Because at that stage, anything resembling, are you, or have you ever been a member of or sympathiser of the Communist Party in America, blah, 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 McCarthyism. Are you guys familiar with McCarthy at all? Okay. What's that movie called, the new one? Is it called McCarthy, or there's a new movie about it recently, but I've forgotten that American actor. Leonardo DiCaprio playing J. Edgar. Do watch that. I'll give you an idea of the milieu at the time. McCarthy doesn't particularly turn up, but that was the time where you simply did not admit that that was your influence. Now, his PhD supervisor was Schumpeter, which is a pretty good start. So his foundations were actually Marx and Schumpeter, not Keynes. Keynes came along a lot later. And you actually read Minsky's works, you'll see that there's a period where he's accepting the textbook treatment of Keynes as being an accurate description of Keynes. It's quite funny to read. So he tried to build a mathematical model, but unfortunately, guess what he used? The Higgs equation. And he added to the Higgs's equation insights from Koleski about increasing risk for showing how much investment takes place, but he started with that model. Now that's the same model I just trashed for you a while ago. So it's no wonder it went nowhere. He made the beta term depend upon financial conditions and said it would decline as the economy grows, which would then, he had the explosive ups and downs I showed you beforehand, and he caused them to turn around by changing the value of the beta coefficient, but it went nowhere for obvious reasons. It was based on a nonsense model. So he finally pretty much gave up mathematical modelling, but he was still trying to explore the implications of finance for economics. And he began from having a very conventional view of what Keynes was about. Look at this one here. We make a Keynesian assumption that consumption demand is independent of interest rates, and this investment demand depends on interest rates, and the rising interest rates will lower the beta coefficient. That's textbook Keynes. Okay. So this is writing in 1965 after he got his PhD. I think he published his PhD in 1958. Of course, that went nowhere as well. But by chance, he read Keynes's General Theory of Employment, the 1937 paper, and that was a revelation. And suddenly his expression, talking after he read that paper in 68, writing in 69, he's now saying, hey, I see myself as being very similar to Keynes. But look what he's saying. Keynes emphasised the importance of financial factors in determining how a capitalist economy operates. And here he says, in his rebuttal of Heine, which is what occurred in the paper called the General Theory of Employment, 1937, he then says this is not the conventional view derived from Higgs, which I believe misses Keynes' point completely. So what you have to do is read the 37 paper, which is Keynes' own summary of the general theory, compare it to Higgs' alleged book review, two totally different documents. So that realisation is when Minsky shifted his position quite dramatically on what Keynes was all about, and that's why I think he called his first book John Maynard Keynes. Think about the choice of the title. He could have called it, a Keynesian theory of the trade cycle, or he could have called financial instability, but no, he called it John Maynard Keynes. which a lot of people think is a biography of Keynes, anything but. It's attributed and an attempt to put Keynes' views in a more systemic way. Now, what you find in Chapter 12 of the General Theory and Chapter 17 plus those 1937 papers is the argument that investment is motivated by the desire to produce assets where the normal supply price is less than the demand price. That's a discontinuity. Again, not a neoclassical concept. And demand price is determined by the yield you think you're going to get from an investment. The supply price is determined by cost of production. And Keynes therefore started to talk in terms of two price levels, which is a very different analysis to the marginal efficiency of investment stuff you still get in textbooks today. Because the normal commodities are a markup on basic costs, but asset prices are set by your expectations of the future when you're operating under fundamental uncertainty. They're two very, very different ways of setting prices. Now, Keynes, in the way he always tends to do, once he realises something he'd never realised before, when he talks about it later, it's obvious. So you look at the statement here. The scale of production of capital assets depends, of course, on the relation between the cost of production and the prices effectively realised in the market. So the MEI stuff, which was dominant in the general theory, disappears by the 1937 papers. And he really doesn't quite say it quite this directly, but he's really saying the idea that you can actually determine marginal efficiency in investment presumes you can actually reduce uncertainty to the same calculable status as certainty itself. Otherwise, you couldn't say what those income streams are likely to be, you couldn't discount. Now, he said, in fact, the uncertainty that affects investment is that about which you cannot form any probability whatsoever. So all the garbage you've done in finance courses about effective returns and so on is so anti that vision Keynes had. And he had three ways in which he said people form their expectations about the future when they can't possibly know what the future is going to be. And he says, for a start, this is the one that I use the most in my own modelling, you presume the present is a much more serviceable guide to the future than a candid examination of past experience would show it to have been. So you simply extrapolate forward current conditions. You accept that prices in the asset market is correct, and you rely upon the sentiment of others, herd behaviour. So all that stuff is like a sensible way of saying how people actually cope with uncertainty about the future, but still act. Now, of course, that means you're going to have a very fragile basis for how you set your prices. A bit of fun and games today watching what happened to the Australian dollar when the RBA came through with a 0.5 cut rather than 0.25. You see the drop in the value of the dollar, almost instantaneous. Now, what's uncertainty? This is one thing that I find economists handle very badly in Keynes' description. Itself was all saying he wasn't saying what uncertainty was, he's saying what it wasn't. It wasn't risk, etc., etc. One of my students a long time ago, Marchesa Dyke, gave this explanation in her seminar on my AGT course, and I've used it every time since. And she said, imagine you're attracted to somebody, and that person has accepted 1 in 5 invitations on dates in the past. Does that mean you've got a 1 in 5 chance of success if you say, will you go out with me? Absolutely not, of course, because you can't use past average to predict how they're going to react to you as an individual, because each experience of being attracted to somebody is unique. Each is different. So what somebody's done in the past cannot be used to predict the future. Okay? That's the essence of uncertainty. And I've often, when I explain this one to students, and when Marchesa first did it, you could just see the whole room go, oh, so that's uncertainty. The beautiful expression. So you're not getting a risky response there, you're getting an uncertain response. You don't know. And that's partly why, again, the same thing applies to investments. The success of past investments doesn't give you a guide as to what's going to happen with the same investments in the future. So how do you cope with relationship uncertainty? Well, you try to work out, you ask their friends. You're doing nothing, you get paralysed into an action. That certainly happened to me in the past. And you ask anyway, you stick your neck out and ask the embarrassing question, I hope you're not going to get your proverbials chopped off. And you follow conventions. You go along to social outings and hope things are going to happen. You play the game, etc., etc. Now that's what investors do as well. It's the same sort of thing. They can't know what's going to happen in the future, but they form expectations about the future and then they convince themselves they're valid. And of course that then affects the prices they'll pay to buy capital assets, and as a result those prices are volatile. Okay? You don't get that stability that you get out of the argument you can discount the future using the time value of money. And that therefore means you're going to have very, very sudden and volatile consequences for investment as well. So and the whole idea of a marginal efficiency of investment is talking about a ratio of the expected cash flows to the current price. But your current price depends upon your expectations about the future, which are fragile. You simply can't make the calculation to begin with. So it's a very, very invalid model to use risk as a proxy for uncertainty. And then Keynes says that his views of uncertainty are consistent with those of Keynes, and he finally reaches this conclusion that the instability of capitalism is due to characteristics it must have. It's a fundamental instability related to both that uncertainty about the future and the nature of volatility in capitalism in general. I want to take a break there, and we'll come back in a short, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, because I've got a radio review coming up in a sec. Okay, so that's Minsky's vision, and what he put together combines various elements of Marx and Keynes and Schumpeter, so I'll talk a bit about those before going into the financial stability hypothesis itself. So his starting point is to say that, again, this is very much a time-based dynamic analysis of capitalism, which sets them apart from the neoclassicals, the sort of thing you find in Schumpeter. Okay, very much you can see the way in which he's being Schumpeter's student affected how he thought about the economy, and thought about it necessarily as a process moving through time. You start when the economy is in a cyclical path and is now doing well. And the debt that it has at that stage reflects the history of the economy, including a period where it wasn't doing so well. There's been a crisis in the recent past. Now, you then have the liability structures people get into, the level of debt they'll take on compared to their cash flows, reflecting the expectations they have of their debt payments. But as the economy continues doing well, people realise in boardrooms that existing debts are easily validated, and units that are heavily in debt cost it pays to lever. Okay. So the acceptance of more and more debt to lever up your gains rises the longer you move away from a period of financial crisis. Now, ultimately, people think, well, there's too large a margin of safety. We can therefore have a tighter margin and make more profits as a result of that. And you start getting more and more debt being used in financing activity. And that actually also increases the price of capital assets. So he's tying a link between the growth of debt and the level of asset prices. And you therefore go from a stable economy, a tranquil economy, into a booming one. But it also leads to speculative excess. And he says, this is the classic, again, Minsky has a beautiful way of putting together very powerful phrases, and one of my favourites here. Stable growth is inconsistent with the manner in which investment is determined in an economy in which debt-financed ownership of capital assets exists. So stability itself is destabilising. If you reached equilibrium, that would drive you away from it because of how it would change people's behaviour. So therefore, and this is again a classic insight, the fundamental instability of the capitalist economy is upward. You read lots of Marxist analyses of capitalism, like Baran and Sweezy and people like that, who did very good work, but their expectations about the nature of capitalist crises was either to see underconsumption or some fundamental reason why capitalism couldn't generate profits, the whole fantasy of the declining rate of profit, or tendency rate of profit to fall, or they'd say there's going to be underconsumption. Minsky, on the other hand, says, no, the fundamental instability is upwards, but that's therefore financed by debt, and the debt you accumulate with the euphoric expectations will exceed the carrying capacity of the economy, and you'll fall back down again. So the tendency to transform doing well into expected investment boom is the basic instability, and that also leads, of course, to after the boom, it leads to the bust. Now, of course, you can't get that out of ISLM or ASAD analysis, because it's a non-equilibrium analysis, where this stuff is still totally ASAD, ISLM, it's all equilibrium based. And leaving out both time and debt, and this whole period of the shift we had from the so-called Keynesian period to the neoclassical period may in fact reflect that transition in the economy itself from a very low level of debt finance to a high level of debt finance over time. But neither theory could have seen this coming. Okay, whether you're working with ISLM analysis or so-called new Keynesian stuff, you could never have seen the crisis coming. And the intriguing thing is, having criticised Hicks for misreading Keynes, and rightly so, in Mr. Keynes and the Classics, you notice that there's questionable work that Hicks had done after that period where he himself was rejecting ISLM. Now again, you see people like Paul Krugman not even being aware the person who developed the theory they prefer to use, ISLM analysis, rejected it, as I gave you last week. And here's the answer. In this essay, Hicks finally repudiates the plotted equilibrium version. So he's throwing out the idea that you can actually use equilibrium for analysing a capitalist economy. He's also saying the whole idea of equilibrium is bad economics for an economy in time. You've got to abandon this obsession with equilibrium to do proper economic analysis. So what you get without this equilibrium fixation, what you can see is the development of riskier and riskier behaviour as a period of cycles and booms go on where more debt's accumulated each time without a final collapsing crisis. So stability, and this is the full phrase, I often summarise it with 3 words, but stability or tranquility in the world of the cyclical past and capitalist financial institutions is destabilising. The basic idea there being a period of stable growth leads to rising expectations. And therefore you get a more and more fragile economy that goes on over time with more debt being accumulated each time. So to go through the model step by step, and I've done this so many times. I wrote this, the first time I wrote this back during my PhD thesis back in about 1993. So pardon me for hitting you guys with it yet again. That you have an economy in historical time, again, both history and time being essential ways in which Minsky's vision differs from the neoclassical vision and from bastard Keynesian work. Therefore, being in historical time, there's a debt-induced recession in the recent past, and because of that recession, both firms and banks are conservative about the amount of debt they'll take on. So again, this is not the asymmetric information idea that Joe Stiglitz pushes. There's an explanation for where financial crises come from. This is shared expectations about an uncertain future. And since the most recent experience scarred people are all conservative. It's a shared expectation on both sides of the borrowing equation. It's not asymmetry. Given that shared expectations, only conservative projects are funded, that because the economy's got through the crisis, it's in the recovery phase, most of those projects succeed. And because they succeed, both firms and banks revise the risk premium they place on investments, accepting a high level of debt to equity, and starting to value assets more highly, out of which you start getting a rising asset price system. Now, for a while, that works in a sensible way because with a drop in risk aversion, it's more investment. With more investment, the economy grows faster. That's a sort of Schumpeterian process, which is a good thing. But you also start getting rising asset prices, which means you can make a profit by speculating on rising asset prices. And the Ponzi start to come out of the woodwork. And you also, of course, with the banking system endogenously creating the amount of money in circulation, that endogenous expansion itself finances part of the rise in asset prices. So riskier investments are taken on, and now you've gone from ones which are conservatively estimated to riskier ones, which are therefore more likely to fail. So you're going to get an accumulation of unsuccessful investments that can't repay the debt they've taken, and that will mean people are starting to have rising levels of bankruptcy and so on that affect solvent businesses. And with asset speculation rising, so along come your Ponzi financiers, or I prefer to call them bonding in Australia, in memory of a not yet departed Alan Bond. And the essential thing about these investors is their cash flow from their so-called investments is less than their debt servicing costs. The classic question people used to ask about Alan Bond is, how can anybody go bankrupt selling beer to Queenslanders when he bought the 4X brewery? And the reason was he borrowed too much money to buy the brewery. The cash flow from the 4X brewery couldn't cover the cost of the debt that he went into to buy the brewery in the first place, or Channel 9, etc., etc. The only way they can survive is by selling assets on a rising market. And before they do that, they've got a desperate demand for more debt because they're fundamentally insolvent. They're losing money. The only way they can keep on operating before they sell assets is to borrow more money. So they're a fundamental part of the pressure to drive up debt levels. And because people don't actually realise that they're fundamentally bankrupt in a particular point in time, they are seen as successes while this is happening, and they're part of what drives up the cost of money as well. My favourite Ponzi there is always Christopher Skase, and I've got to actually check and see if I can write a decent source for this, but I remember reading the story with Rodney Adler before his short incarnation at Her Majesty's pleasure, talking about what he and his dad used to do when they ran FAI, where FAI was the main company providing finance to Christopher Skase. They said they'd alternately saw him, and each time they saw him, they'd raise the interest rate they wanted to charge him only by 1%, waiting to see if Skase would have any reaction other than yes. And he never, ever objected. The final rate at which they suggested charging one of his projects was 25% per annum. He just said yes, because if he didn't get the money, he would have folded. So there's a desperate desire for more debt, and of course that's going to make the overall commercial price for money rise as well. Now, this is going to lead to both the supply of money and the demand for money rising, the whole endogenous process, rising market interest rates, and of course more and more unsuccessful projects accumulating debt and causing chain reaction problems. The Ponzi's are losing money, but people are buying their shares at the same time. So the fragility they cause doesn't just stay with them, it gets transmitted through the whole system. A good friend of mine has a lovely little cameo from this period in her toilet, which is her shares in Quintex, designed to help you go to the bathroom. Quintex being Christopher Skase's old company. So the investments that were built during this euphoric expectation stage fail. Rising rates make some projects too conservative. There are all sorts of triggers that happen here. And non-Ponzi's then will attempt to sell some of their assets at what they think is a broad market. But it's nowhere near as broad as they think. The market then floods. And that trend for rising asset prices slows down. And as soon as it does, it's goodbye, good night, Josephine. The economy starts going backward. The Ponzi's can't sell their assets for a profit anymore. And they have debt servicing costs far greater than their cash flows. So as soon as there's any call for them to roll over a debt, they've had it. Asset prices collapse. Debt to equity ratios rise for a while because equity prices fall while debt remains constant. That endogenous expansion of the money supply goes into reverse. Actually, one thing I must say I could also find one day is back in 1988 or 91, I think it was, a couple of Macquarie University rational expectations macroeconomists predicted the rate of inflation in 1991, I think it was, would be 27% in Australia, on the basis that the increase in money supply in 1990 was 30%. They subtracted 3% for the rate of growth and said, therefore, people must rationally expect the prices will rise by 27% next year, therefore, for inflation will be 27% next year. They were wrong by 28%. It was -1. So the endogenous expansion of the money supply goes in reverse, the economy collapses, you're back where you started again. And that's the basic cyclical model of Minsky. Now, high inflation, if you have high inflation, how much we had back in the 80s, when this sort of stuff happened, then the rising inflation price level actually helps you repay the debts, and that means that you'll get stagflation. So it's a Keynesian explanation for stagflation that Keynes wasn't supposed to have. And that'll mean the cycle will renew once the debt levels fall back down again. But if you have low inflation and you can't repay the debts, and that chain reaction affected bankruptcy, to mean even businesses that weren't speculative can fold, you get a depression. And that's why I think that's what we're in now, globally. Certainly Europe is in one. Even Krugman came out with a new book saying we're in a depression, so finally the word's being used. Big government, what will happen there? Well, Minsky's argument was largely that the answer to spending the governments do provides a cash flow that firms wouldn't otherwise have during a downturn. And that cash flow lets them service the debts which would otherwise send them bankrupt. So I see this as a sort of financial explanation for automatic stabilizers coming out of Minsky's work. So what I'm going to do now is go through my Minsky models, starting with ones that are non-monetary, and then next week I'm going to go into the monetary models. So the starting point for all this is Goodwin's growth cycle model. So we're back to a bit of mathematics here for a while. And the basic story from Goodwin's model put into mathematical form, the verbal model that Marx had in chapter 25 of volume 1 of Capital, explaining how you can have permanent cycles in the economy. And the way he put it together is so that the amount of output determines how many workers you employ. You can then use the level of employment to determine the rate of change of wages, the Phillips curve relationship. Subtract wages from output, you get profits. Profits determine investment, and the very simple model that Goodwin had, all profits were invested. I have to generalise that, which I'll show you later. Investment is the rate of change of capital stock. Capital determines output. You're back where you started again. You're now back up to y once more. And of course, you can simulate it. I am going to, pardon the great, it's more bad animation, so I'll fix that up. So what I'm going to do is show you how to build a model for the system differential equation this time round. So a couple of things that good one assume was constant rate of growth of population and constant rate of growth of technology. You can embody those in the model as well, but I'll use them as external constants. And you can then work out differential equations for the two system states in the model. The two system states are the income distribution, which in here I'm looking at worker share of output, so omega is wages divided by output, and the employment rate, the lambda here being the amount of workers divided by population. So I'm going to take it a bit of slow back. I'll try to do it more slowly now. I do a huge amount of work in doing chain and product rule expansions of differential equations. So the rate of change of the employment rate is the rate of change of labour divided by the rate of change of population. So, whoops, that's wrong. Oh boy, we've got to pick that up. Pardon me, pick that up. Okay. What you get out of this is, you can then say, pardon me. Yeah, that's okay. Pardon me, really, there's sort of one over in the equation there. So I'm saying if you expand the rate of change of labour divided by that population, there's 1 over n dLdt plus labour times the differential of 1 over n. Okay? So what you get out of that when you expand it is you get 1 over n dLdt, and labour is now output divided by labour productivity, plus labour multiplied by minus 1 over n squared, which is differentiating the quadratic inside there, times the differential of n. Taking n on the outside, this is population. So I'm now saying this whole expression here, I'm now turning this one out, doing the same chain of product rule expansion here, or chain of product rule. And I've now got minus L over n times 1 over n dn dt, there's your rate of growth of population. So I can now say this is L over n, which is the employment ratio. That's the percentage rate of growth of population, which is beta. So my first expansion here. And now I'm expanding this one again. I've now got 1 over 88. That's the rate of growth of technical progress. That's going to be alpha. And I've now substituted for y capital divided by the capital output ratio, which is where I'm going to next substitute investment. So I can now say this is going to be the APE is investment divided by the accelerator. That's y over a, which is the amount of workers you need to hire. Multiplied, y is labour multiplied by labour productivity. I'm going to divide by this and cancel that out. And I've now got, in a simple little model, investment is profits. Profits is output minus wages. And keep on going, and finally, I end up with it. I've got omega, I've divided through by labour, taking labour on the outside, and now I've got W divided by A, which is the wage level divided by labour productivity. And we'll expand it out, and that actually is the worker share of output. It's tedious, but I'll show you why you get there ultimately. So finally, you've got an expression for the rate of change of employment in the simple model. You're going to get current value multiplied by, that's actually the rate of growth of the economy. That's level, that's a percent rate of saving rate of investment, minus labour productivity minus population growth. So tedious, but worth getting there. Same sort of thing for working out the wages share of output, and I'll get there in one particular hit. Same sort of use of product rule and chain rule throughout. And finally, you can say the rate of growth of wages share of output is wages share of output multiplied by the Phillips curve minus labour productivity. So that's the basic procedure as the particular steps down here. And what you get is a credited price system. Okay, the same sort of negative positive feedback you get in a credited price system. And what you get out of it is cyclical growth. If you simulate that sort of system, you're going to get cycle in employment and wages share of output. And it's a closed limit cycle. So what I'm doing here is just using the differential equation solver in MathPad. State the equations up there, solve them numerically, given initial conditions, and then generate a simulation of the whole system. So that's my foundation for working out the Fisher-Minsky vision, because an essential part of Minsky's vision is the cyclical nature of capitalism. The cycles he was thinking of really come out of Schumpeter's visions of the cycles in investment, but I'll bring those in later. Here I'm just looking at the wage distribution cycle that you find in Marx. And I bring it in by adding the finance sector, by having debt inside there, and adding the realistic assumption, the fact, that capitalists borrow to invest when their expectations of profit are high. And what you get is a system that can give you disequilibrium as an explanation of the Great Depression, which is again Minsky's vision. So there's the basic Goodwin model, those two equations. The first step towards building a model of Minsky is to get rid of the unrealistic assumption that Goodwin used in a very simple model, that capitalists invest all their profits, to say they invest more during a boom and less during a slump. And I take out depreciation as well, so now rather than having 1 minus omega up here, I've got some function of the rate of profit, a nonlinear function of the rate of profit. And bringing in debt in the way that Schumpeter talks about it, and Fammer and French have actually proven that it happens. And Schumpeter's argument was that the real source of investment finance is the change in debt. Because again, you think about this in double entry bookkeeping terms. If you imagine financing investment by saving, then what's actually happening is somebody who could consume is instead giving that money to a firm and saying, please invest with this money, which finances the investment, but it reduces consumption. Okay? But if you have a bank saying, that's a great idea, here's $1 million, by the way, you owe us $1 million, you actually add to aggregate demand without subtracting from consumption power. So Schumpeter's argument was that the conventional answer about savings isn't totally absurd. You can make a hypothetical argument for it, but think it through, is that the main source of investment finance is the creation of purchasing power by banks, and that it's not a case of transforming existing purchasing power, but creating new purchasing power out of nothing. This is by far from the first statement of endogenous money, but it's probably one of the most eloquent statements of it back in 1934. Now, ironically, good empirical work by neoclassicals confirms the same thing. I love this when this happens, when you find people who normally have a theoretical position that's different to yours, when they do empirical work, come up with something I can support my own arguments with. And this is from a paper from Fammer and French in 1999, where they used the CompuStat database of American corporations, added up aggregate investment, aggregate retained earnings, aggregate new stock issues, and then correlated them with investment. And what they found was that new stock had only a very trivial positive correlation with investment. And that's, if you think about it, if you're not borrowing the money to buy the shares, and sometimes people do that, of course, then any money you use to buy shares rather than go shopping reduces the potential demand that investment's trying to satisfy. Retained earnings had a positive correlation of 0.56, but not a perfect correlation. But notice the punchline. The source of financing most correlated with investment, this is aggregate investment, is long-term debt, aggregate long-term debt. And so the correlation is 0.79 over a 40-year period. And then they said these correlations confirm the impression, you can see in the figure itself, that debt plays a key role in accommodating year-by-year variation in investment. So Fammer and French, the people who argue that debt doesn't matter, in the Modigliani Miller hypothesis, nor the other trap of the efficient market hypothesis they help promote. And Fammer is still defending, even after this sort of work, and even after he argued in 2004 that you shouldn't use it empirically anymore. But you can't abandon old beliefs. You find a strong support for the Minsky and Schumpeterian idea that investment is financed by the change in aggregate debt. So you bring in debt finance investment. The simple way to put it is exactly putting in differential equation terms the verbal statement that Fammer and French made a moment ago. Change in debt is investment minus profits. The way I model investment would say this: the investment is some function of profits times the level of output. So you've got that K over pi is an investment share of output argument with a nonlinear function. And then profit is now net interest payments. So your profit is output minus wages minus interest you've got to pay on existing level of debt. So you now got a new system state, which is the debt to output ratio, and brace yourselves. Same sort of story. The D, little d, is big D over Y. Expand out the differential. Substitute, here I've got d dx, well that's up there, that's I minus y, so I'll substitute that there. I've now got the debt ratio multiplied by 1 over y dy dt, that's the rate of growth of the economy. Now the rate of growth of the economy, actually I think I'll do the long expansion here, I don't do the shortcut. So I'm now saying here's my investment function, paid y times y, and here's minus profit, which is output minus wages minus existing debt. So expand all that term out. And now substituted capital divided by the accelerator at the output level. Now I'm going through doing a bit of cancellation here. So I've got the y dividing all this, I get 1 minus I and 1 is R times D. And here I've got K y, the investment function, multiplied by output divided by output. That's going to cancel out as well. And I've now got the rate of change of capital stock, which comes down to investment minus depreciation, which is what I'm bringing in here. On we go. I won't, it's tedious enough trying to explain equations like that step by step. But what you finally get is this expression. I put it in a few ways to try to point out different ways in which debt turns up several times in that one equation. What I've got the rate of change of the debt ratios of the investment function minus profit share of output minus the debt ratio times the growth rate. A complex expression. Damn. Another animation picks up. What I get is that system overall. Now, this is now 3 differential equations which are non-linear. And the part that I should have animated down here is a vital point about non-linear systems. There's a qualitative shift in going from a 2-dimensional system to a 3-dimensional system. There's 2 very essential papers in the whole topic. The first one by Lee York, which is a classic in the literature. Period 3 implies chaos. Meaning when you have a 3-dimensional system, you go from regular cycles to irregular aperiodic behaviour. And Robert May, an Australian mathematical biologist, also had a very important paper on that front. And the point they made is that the 2-dimensional dynamic differential equation model can only have 3 real basic properties. It either converges to equilibrium, or it diverges from equilibrium, or it reaches a permanent limit cycle. Now, the reason can actually be quite easily seen geometrically. So here you have those 3 choices: converge to equilibrium, explode to infinite cycles, or follow a fixed orbit for a 2-dimensional system. And the reason for that is that what you get is a time path and an initial set of initial conditions, and each solution can't intersect with any other solution. So you can't have any 2 time paths intersecting with each other. And so what you can do is actually describe this like in a plane. Let's say here's your x variable on here, here's your y variable. Your time path is going to be some sort of cycle here where you can't cross any particular path you do. So if you start out here and come in, side where you started, you've got to keep on going inside. And you spiral into equilibrium. If you start going outside, like you've got to continue spiraling out and go up to breakdown, you may converge to a loop from one side or the other. So you spiral out and finally converge to a cycle here, and the other way coming in from the outside. That's the end of the behaviours you can do. Anything else you try to do, you're going to intersect the line you're going through, and you can't do that in a 2-dimensional system. For a 3-dimensional system, those are your possibility. I might look at that particular slide later on. Imagine drawing in a cube. So rather than just doing x and y, I have x, y, and z. And I'll say, okay, run a line through here without intersecting itself. You can do anything you like. Okay? The third dimension means the system can go literally anywhere. So what you get out of that, when you look at a cyclical system, is aperiodic cycles. When you project that down on a 2-dimensional plane to say what's happening in employment versus wages share, you can get all sorts of possibilities coming out of it. And May put this beautifully in the paper I referred to a moment ago. This is written in '76. Think how prescient that is today. Not only in research, but also in the everyday world of politics and economics. We would all be better off if more people realised that simple nonlinear systems do not necessarily possess simple dynamical properties. If we had that wisdom now, we would potentially not have had the chaos of the financial system we've got ourselves into. And the model I've shown you a moment ago demonstrates this, because here's the overall model now, stating it in terms where I can simulate it. So that's the statement of the model. Again, this is done in MathCAD. Those are the initial conditions. And that's the simulation block with two different simulations. And when I simulate it, the outcome depends upon the initial conditions themselves. When close to equilibrium, the system will converge, but far from equilibrium, it diverge into a depression. So the one on the right-hand side there, on the left-hand side, apart from being dyslexic here, this one clearly is cycling towards equilibrium with employment and wage share. This one, wilder and wilder cycles, and obviously going to lead to a breakdown. Looking behind it, what you've got happening is two very different sets of behaviour at the level of debt. One, you're going down towards this particular simulation has negative debt, so firms are accumulating positive bank balances, in other words. And the other one, you've got the cyclical process that Minsky spoke about. A series of periods where debt rises in a series of cycles, ratcheting up, each boom starting with a high level of debt and the one beforehand, and finally take on such a level of debt that the economy can't repay it and you collapse. So I'm going to go through a bit of the mechanics behind that modelling and then extend it to include the government sector. So that's the pattern without debt. When you plot wage share against employment, you get a closed cycle, not actually a limit cycle, but a closed cycle. With debt, you get the potential for, again now looking at it in 3 dimensions, that's spiralling into an equilibrium point. Notice that there's rising debt and then falling debt towards the end there. But you can equally have that happen. And I think I've got a little simulation here. I might take a look at it. We're now simulating the same thing in VisSim. And that's the unstable one. So a whole lot of different tools with which you can simulate this sort of behaviour. Now, what you've gone is from a system with a neutral equilibrium where you neither get attracted to nor repelled from equilibrium, to one where with nonlinear investment and with capitalist borrowing money to finance investment, you get this potential, this classic asymmetry that causes a crisis. Firms commit to debt during the boom and have to repay it during the slump, quite simply put. Okay, so there's a tendency there for the debt level to ratchet up over time, leading to the sort of crisis we're in now. And close to equilibrium, you'll taper into equilibrium. Far from equilibrium, the debt level will overwhelm the economy. So that's the essential vision that Minsky had. Sorry to be going so fast with the slides. Okay. Now, Minsky also made the case about big government. So one way I considered that in my model was to look at government being a counter-cyclical spender into the economy. What does that do to this simple model? And with all of the people that Minsky is based upon, Fisher and Minsky as well, Fisher and Keynes, they see the government as providing a reflation, the tendency for reflation in the middle of deflation. And with Keynes' vision, government spending gives you the capacity to spend your way out of a crisis. Minsky's vision really sees it in the financial sense. Firms are getting a cash flow from government spending they wouldn't otherwise get during the downturn, and that cash flow lets them repay their debts. So modelling it, I brought in a simple function saying, well, government spending is given straight to firms, bypassing workers effectively, and it will rise if unemployment exceeds 5%, fall if it's less than 5%. The basic way to say that the level of government spending was a function of the employment rate, which is pretty much saying the government has to spend more money if unemployment rises. Can you shut the door there? Thanks. So I now have a new system statement that model which is the level of government spending, and my definition of the rate of profit is now output minus wages minus and get plus government spending, which can be positive or negative, by the way, in a simple model. That's the relationship I used there. Said that if you had a rate of unemployment of 5% or employment of 95%, government spending remains constant. If unemployment rises above that level, government spending increases. If unemployment falls below that level, government spending falls. So a simple way to try to capture the behaviour of the government sector. So starting from that relationship, when you expand it out, I get the rate of change of government. The government spending to output ratio is going to be that ratio multiplied by their reaction function minus the rate of growth of the economy. And we put it all together, you get a four-dimensional system. There's a wages share of output, employment ratio, debt to output ratio, and finally the new one, the government subsidy to output ratio, where profit is now net of government spending. What it gives you is a system that behaves like that. I want to now go through some of the characteristics of this particular model and make a few more points about how absurd it is to use equilibrium thinking in a dynamic system. Again, even if you think, well, you know, we've got to work with dynamics, but I can use equilibrium as the long-term average of the system. No, you can't. Oh, damn, pardon me. That's looking at the, well, it's an old slide, obviously. This is the wages share of output against employment. That's the dynamics you get. Now, again, it's so complicated, it looks like it's intersecting. That's now a four-dimensional system. So beforehand I was showing what happened with a three-dimensional system. Imagine in four dimensions the degree of systemic freedom you get for the behaviour of the system. Now, it's not a strange attractor. I thought it was when I first spotted it. It actually follows to a stable four-dimensional limit cycle. But it does have an unstable equilibrium. And I think I've got, let's see, let's take a look at that one as well. Oh, a bit too fast. You want to see it again? I'll slow that down. Hang on a sec. System. Wrong one. Oh, damn. This mouse pad's a bit of a pain. System properties run in real time. They run by, say, acceleration of 10, so it'll take 40 seconds to run. So it looks like I'll go take with the plot of employment against wages share of output. You might think the system is stabilising, then it starts to get wilder and wilder cycles. It gets breaking down, then the cycles fall back on each other again. I call this my toilet bowl in space. That's the behaviour of the system. Rather more complicated than you might expect from a neoclassical model, but it's even more complicated than you might think from looking at that. I'll explain why here. So that's the dynamics in three dimensions. To bring in the fourth, I need to change the colour to talk about the government spending. So you're not in equilibrium, even in the long run. Okay, the whole vision that you reach equilibrium itself in the long run is a fallacy from a simplistic understanding of what is really a complex system. And what you've got is a homostatic stabiliser process going on, so taking very close to now the employment rate and then government spending. And what you find is everything's slightly out of phase. It's falling in employment, leads to rising government spending, but there's a phase difference between the two. There's no time lags in this system. It's all continuous time. But the difference is the phase differences, which is the same thing that applies to sine and cosine. Okay? No matter how often you first and second and third and nth different sine and cosine, they'll always be out of phase. So dynamic systems don't have to have co-integrated cycles. Again, one of the mistakes from thinking linearly about the economy. So it confirms, this model in a simple way confirms Minsky's vision about what the role of big government does, but that anti-cyclical spending enables debts to be repaid and the cycle then renews once the debt levels are reduced. But of course, we've gone well beyond what I've shown in that model, the level of debt we've got into in the most recent crisis, and I'll talk about that in more detail on the next couple of lectures. Now, the full Monty of the system would be not just a cycle of economy, but also including debts and prices and money. And I'll get there. I finally built that complete model. But first of all, let's take a look at the simpler one for a short while, because there are some insights I'd like you to get out of this system. Just recently, by the way, my model's been analysed by a couple of mathematical financial economists at the University of Toronto, at the Fields Institute. So I'm heading off there, and after this lecture series, which is finished, I've got to talk about exam here. Remind me to talk about the exam. I'm going up to work with them for 6 weeks. So there's the basic Minsky model, and there's a non-trivial equilibrium for it. If I should say what's the equilibrium for all these ratios, and I've got with the ratio, rate of change ratios are 0. So I can then solve for that system. And 2 out of 3 of them are quite straightforward, that they involve nonlinear transformation. Notice here, equilibrium rate of profit ends up being I'm not saying the equilibrium rate of profit is equal to these terms. I'm saying a nonlinear function that the equilibrium rate of profit is equal to the accelerated multiplier of sum of depreciation, technical change, and population growth. A nonlinear transformation of the equilibrium employment rate is equal to the rate of labour productivity. The debt relationship, expressing in a couple of terms there, is equal to the gap between the investment rate, which is the nonlinear transformation of the rate of profit, and the rate of profit, divided by the growth rate. Now, that's a lot more complex than your standard neoclassical equilibrium. Because I said, again, nonlinear, not that this variable is equal to those constants in equilibrium. It's a nonlinear transformation of the variables equal to those constants. And the crucial point that I'm going to hammer about why you can't use equilibrium as a projection of what the future is going to be in a model like this is the time average is not the equilibrium. And not just by a tiny difference, by an enormous difference. So I'll illustrate as to why. So these are my equilibrium systems. Funnily enough, even though the system is defined in terms of the wage ratio of output and employment and the debt ratio, the equilibrium terms the employment rate, the debt ratio, and the profit share, not the wages share. Profit shares are residual. So working out the equilibrium level of employment, that's the inverse Phillips curve transformation of the labour productivity. Profit rate is the inverse investment function transformation of all that, and then I can finally work out as an average again, a couple of transformations. But the equilibrium level of wages is residual, and it's a negative function of the rate of interest. The higher the rate of interest, the lower the worker share, which is quite intriguing because in this particular model, the workers aren't paying any interest. Okay? They end up being the ones who pay for the higher rate of interest rate when the rates are higher. Quite intriguing. Now, there's your equilibrium convergence when you're close to equilibrium. There's your breakdown when you're further away from equilibrium. And you can't get that sort of behaviour out of a linear model. And again, a lot of what neoclassicals think they know about dynamic systems comes from applying linear thinking to a non-linear world. Now, again, just to emphasise the point about there's your stability again in 3 dimensions. There's your instability also in 3 dimensions. So, I can actually set up the system with it. I can find a point where you flip from this sort of behaviour to that point of behaviour with an infinitesimal change in one of those initial conditions. So, one important point about a complex model, even though it's deterministic, it's non-ergodic. Because you can't use the statistical average of the past as a way of predicting the future of the model. It won't work. And it's also non-equilibrium. You can't use equilibrium as a centre of gravity. That's better illustrated by using the government sector model. As I said, it's non-chaotic, but the time average of the system substantially differs from the equilibrium. There's your system. Using exponential functions, I've been able to count my rate. The employment rate in equilibrium is 97.5%, so 2.5% unemployment roughly. The profit share is 16% of output, which is about equivalent to about a 6% rate of profit. The debt ratio is 54% of GDP. and the government spending is actually negative, so it's taxing, is 27% of spending. So those are equilibrium values. Start your equilibrium, that's what happens. Okay? You diverge from the equilibrium and you then have complex cycles in all the variables. That's 3 of the 4 shown there. Wages share, employment, and the debt ratio. That's looking at the employment ratio versus the wages share output. And the blue dot is the system's equilibrium. The black dot is the average. Now I'm talking about the wages share being 15% higher over time than the equilibrium, and the employment rate being about 1.5% lower. That's how big the difference is between the average of the system and the equilibrium. So again, you cannot apply equilibrium analysis to the future of the system. So one of the many reasons I said that we've got to, if economics are going to progress, it has to abandon the obsession with equilibrium. Now, that was a useful model because it led me to make this statement back in 1993, published in 1995. But having done the model, put the model together, I said it tells us we should go beyond the state of mind that Keynes describes so well of using the past stability as a guide to the future. And I have this punchline at the end of the paper: the chaotic dynamics in the paper should warn us against accepting a period of relative tranquility as anything other than a lull before the storm. I published that in 1993, which is before what neoclassical called the Great Moderation began. And that's the particular simulation that I had at the time of the behaviour of the employment rate, the wages share, and the debt to output ratio. And what you can clearly see is the tendency that the cycle of employment wages share to diminish, looking like a period of stability, and ultimately leading to a period of rising instability and finally a breakdown. Now, I'm not saying the system is, when we live in this, is quite that simple, but I think I captured the fundamental dynamics of what we've been through both the Great Moderation and now what the economists are finally calling the Depression. But it's still only partially Minsky. I haven't got money inside there. It's only implicit. There's no price dynamics as a result of that. What I'm going to do next week is generate a strictly monetary model. Whoops, pardon me, I didn't go there. I'm not going to go to that part of the lecture. So I'll do that next week. And what I'm going to do after that is incorporate the government sector with a strictly monetary model as well.